The fire in the grate had burned low by the time Dr. Mortimer finished arranging his papers on the table. He looked across at Sherlock Holmes and then at me, his eyes serious behind the round lenses of his spectacles. Outside, the London fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, but inside the room, the only sound was the occasional snap of coal and the soft rustle as Mortimer turned a page. He drew a steady breath and began.
It started more than 2 centuries ago, on the wild Devon moors, he said. Sir Hugo Baskerville was a hard man, quick to anger and slow to mercy. One night he laid eyes on a farmer's daughter and decided she would be his. When she refused, he and his companions rode to the farm, seized the girl, and carried her back to Baskerville Hall. They locked her in an upper room while Hugo drank and boasted below. She escaped through a window, climbed down the ivy, and fled across the moor toward her home. Hugo discovered her absence and gave chase with his pack of hounds. The night was black, the ground treacherous. By the time the riders reached the edge of a deep mire, the girl lay dead of terror and exhaustion. Hugo's men found her body first. Then they found Hugo. He stood alone in a hollow, his face turned upward, his throat torn open. Above him loomed a great beast, black as the peat, with eyes that burned like coals. The hounds cowered and would not approach. The men who saw it later swore the creature had come straight from hell to claim the soul of their master. Hugo Baskerville died without a sound. From that night, the curse walked with the family. Every generation produced a tale of sudden death or vanishing on the moor, always accompanied by the sound of a hound baying where no hound should be.
Mortimer paused to sip water. His voice had dropped, yet it carried clearly in the quiet room. He continued with the more recent chapter.
Sir Charles Baskerville, the last baronet, had lived abroad for many years, and returned only when age and illness made the London climate unbearable. He settled at the Hall and tried to improve the estate. He drained fields, repaired cottages, and gave money to the village school. The tenants liked him. The servants said he was quiet and generous. But he carried the old fear. He would not walk the moor after dark, and he kept the great gates locked once the sun set. 3 weeks ago, Sir Charles rose from dinner and stepped onto the yew alley for his usual evening stroll. The path runs between high hedges that block the wind and the view. At the far end stands a small summer house, where he sometimes sat to watch the sunset. That evening, the butler, Barrymore, saw him leave the house at 10 minutes past 10. The night was clear, the moon nearly full. Barrymore locked the doors and went to bed. At 11:30, he heard the hall clock strike and noticed the front door still stood open. He went to close it and found Sir Charles lying on the gravel just beyond the gate. The face was twisted in horror. One hand clutched at his chest. There were no marks of violence, no footprints near the body, except those of Sir Charles himself.
Mortimer's fingers tightened on the paper. He described the inquest. The coroner spoke of a weak heart and the strain of excitement. The doctor who examined the body agreed. Yet one detail remained. Near the body, pressed into the soft earth of the flower bed, were the prints of a gigantic hound. They were not the marks of any dog kept on the estate. They led from the moor, circled the body once, and returned the way they had come. No one at the inquest wished to mention them. The coroner called them the tracks of a stray. The jury returned a verdict of natural causes. Holmes leaned forward slightly. Mortimer noticed the movement and nodded.
"There is more," he said. "After the funeral, I walked the alley myself. The prints were still visible where the rain had not reached them. I measured one. It was larger than any mastiff or bloodhound I have seen. The stride was long. Whatever made them had been running. I asked the gamekeeper if he had lost a dog. He had not. I asked the villagers. They looked away and muttered about the old story. That night, as I sat in the library with the windows open, I heard a long, low howl from the direction of the great Grimpen Mire. It was not the cry of a fox or an owl. It rose and fell and died away across the empty heather."
Mortimer stopped. He folded the papers and placed them back in his case. The fire had settled into a steady red glow. Holmes remained silent for several minutes, his fingertips pressed together. I watched the shadows move across the ceiling and thought of the wide, empty moor waiting 300 miles away. Mortimer stood at last and reached for his hat. Before he left, he turned once more.
"The heir arrives from Canada in a few days," he said. "His name is Henry Baskerville. He knows nothing of the legend. I thought it best that someone should tell him before he sets foot on the moor."
Holmes rose and walked him to the door. When the street door closed behind our visitor, the room felt larger and colder than before. I poured 2 glasses of whiskey and handed one to Holmes. He took it without speaking, his eyes already distant, following a path that led across dark peat and under a cold moon. Holmes set his glass down, untouched, and turned toward the desk where the evidence lay scattered under the lamplight. The warning note had arrived that afternoon, folded twice and slipped under the door of the hotel where Sir Henry Baskerville was staying. Holmes lifted it now between thumb and forefinger, holding it close to the flame so that the uneven letters stood out against the cheap paper. The words were printed in a clumsy hand, each one formed with deliberate pressure, as though the writer feared the pencil might snap. "As you value your life or your reason, keep away from the moor." Holmes traced the edge of the paper with one nail, noting where the ink had smudged from a nervous thumb. He brought the sheet to his nose and inhaled once, then set it aside with a small nod that invited me to speak if I wished. I did not. Instead, I watched the way his eyes narrowed, already assembling facts that remained invisible to me. He moved next to the envelope that had contained the note. The postmark showed it had been posted in London the previous evening, yet the paper itself smelled faintly of peat and something sharper, like the oil used on country roads. Holmes held the envelope to the light and studied the watermark, then compared the printed address with a sample of Sir Henry's own handwriting taken from an earlier letter. The difference was obvious even to my untrained eye. The sender had copied the style of a London clerk rather than the bolder strokes of a man from the West Country. The paw print came last. Holmes had asked for it to be cast in plaster the moment the telegram arrived describing the tracks found near the body of Sir Charles. The cast rested now on a sheet of blotting paper, its edges still damp from the journey. Holmes turned it slowly under the lamp, studying the depth of each pad and the drag marks where the claws had scored the earth. The print was larger than any dog's I had ever seen, yet the spacing between the toes suggested something that moved with terrible purpose rather than the random padding of a stray. He set the cast down and reached for his pipe, packing it with slow, deliberate motions. The smoke curled upward in thin ribbons while he stared at the ceiling, though I knew his mind was already walking the long drive that led to Baskerville Hall. After several minutes he spoke, his voice low and measured, as though he were dictating to an unseen stenographer. The note had been written by someone who feared discovery, yet could not remain silent. The choice of words suggested local knowledge, for only a resident would know how quickly fear could turn to madness on those moors. The envelope, however, pointed to an accomplice in the city, someone willing to post the warning without knowing its full meaning. I asked whether the hound itself might be a fabrication meant to frighten the heir away from his inheritance. Holmes shook his head once. The print was real enough, he said, and the recent death of Sir Charles had been too convenient for those who stood to gain from the estate remaining empty. He lifted the cast again and pointed to a faint ridge along the outer edge of the print. That mark, he explained, was not a claw, but the impression of a boot heel pressed into the same soft ground moments after the creature had passed. Someone had followed the tracks, perhaps to confirm the effect they would have on any witness who stumbled upon them. The room grew quieter as the fire settled. Holmes paced the length of the rug twice, pausing each time he reached the window to glance down at the empty street. He spoke of the legend next, not as superstition, but as a weapon that could be wielded by a clever enemy. The story of the hound had been repeated for generations until belief had worn smooth the rough edges of doubt. A man arriving at Baskerville Hall, already primed by such tales, would interpret any large dog as proof that the curse lived on. Yet the print before us belonged to no ordinary dog, and the timing of the note suggested the sender knew Sir Henry's plans before they were announced in the newspapers. Holmes returned to the desk and arranged the three pieces of evidence in a line: the note, the envelope, the cast. He studied them together for a long moment, then drew a sheet of paper from the drawer and began to write. His pen moved steadily, listing names and places without hesitation. At the top he placed the name of the butler, Barrymore, whose long service to the family gave him both opportunity and motive. Below that he added the name of a distant relative whose claim on the estate had been overlooked in the original will. He paused only to tap ash from his pipe, then continued until the page held a short column of facts and questions that connected the printed warning to the tracks on the moor. When he finished, he folded the sheet and slipped it into his coat pocket. The whiskey glass remained where I had left it, the liquid untouched and already losing its warmth. Holmes looked at it without interest, then crossed to the window once more. Outside, the fog had begun to rise from the river, softening the edges of the street lamps. He stood there until the first cab rattled past, its horses' hooves striking the cobbles in a rhythm that matched the beat of his own thoughts. He turned at last and met my eyes. Tomorrow we would meet Sir Henry at the station, he said, and travel west together. The moor would keep its secrets until we arrived, but the note and the print had already narrowed the field of possibilities to a single, dangerous path. The cab rattled past in a steady clatter that echoed the quickening pulse of the morning itself. Holmes stood beside me at the curb, his tall frame cutting a sharp silhouette against the grey London light. We had our instructions clear enough, and with the strange note and the telltale print still fresh in our minds, there was little room left for delay. Sir Henry Baskerville waited at the station, eager to begin the journey that would carry us all to the edge of the Devonshire moors. We reached Paddington in good time. Sir Henry greeted us with the brisk warmth of a man who had already grown impatient with city life. He carried himself with the easy confidence of one long accustomed to open spaces, though the weight of the recent warnings had left faint lines at the corners of his eyes. The three of us boarded the train without ceremony, settling into a compartment where the rumble of the rails soon drowned out the last sounds of London. Holmes spoke little at first, content to watch the countryside unfold beyond the window. I kept my attention on Sir Henry, noting how he scanned every new face that passed in the corridor. The moor already seemed to call to him, drawing his thoughts ahead to the hall that bore his name. By midday, the train had left the suburbs behind. Fields gave way to rolling hills, and the air through the open window carried the sharper scent of earth and heather. Sir Henry talked freely of his plans. He intended to take up residence at once, to walk the grounds himself and meet every tenant who still held land under the Baskerville name. He spoke of the old stories, too, the legend of the hound that had haunted his family for generations. Yet he dismissed them with a short laugh, saying a man could not live in fear of shadows when real dangers might already be at his door. Holmes listened without comment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin, but I could see the quick flicker of interest in his eyes whenever Sir Henry mentioned the servants who still kept the hall. We changed trains at Exeter and continued westward as the light began to fade. The landscape grew wilder with each mile. Stone walls replaced hedgerows, and the distant hills took on a darker, more forbidding outline. Sir Henry pointed out landmarks he remembered from his boyhood visits, though those visits had been brief. The great house itself had stood empty for years after his uncle's death, tended only by the Barrymores, the elderly couple who had served the family for decades. He described them as loyal and quiet, yet something in his tone suggested he wondered whether loyalty alone could explain their long stay on such an isolated estate. Darkness had fallen by the time we reached the small station that served the moor. A carriage waited, its lamps already lit against the gathering night. The driver, a taciturn fellow with a face weathered by wind and rain, loaded our trunks without a word. We climbed aboard, and the horses started at once along a narrow road that wound upward between low hills. The air grew cooler, carrying the damp breath of peat and gorse. Sir Henry leaned forward, peering through the gloom as if he might catch the first glimpse of his inheritance. I kept one hand near the pocket where I had placed the revolver Holmes had insisted I carry. The note warning Sir Henry to stay away from the moor still rested in my mind like an unwelcome companion. After an hour, the road leveled and the carriage turned between two tall stone posts. Baskerville Hall rose before us, a long, low shape of granite and slate roofed with heavy tiles. Lights showed in only a few windows. The front door opened as we drew up, and a tall man in dark clothing stepped out to meet us. This was Barrymore, the butler. He carried a lamp that threw his features into sharp relief, a strong jaw, deep-set eyes, and an expression that gave nothing away. His wife followed close behind, her hands folded at her waist, offering a quiet welcome that seemed rehearsed rather than warm. They took our bags and led us inside, where the hall stretched long and dim beneath a carved ceiling. Portraits of earlier Baskervilles lined the walls, their eyes following us as we passed. Sir Henry moved through the rooms with quick curiosity, pausing at each familiar piece of furniture and each new alteration. Barrymore answered his questions in short, respectful sentences. The house had been kept in good order, the roof repaired the previous spring, the cellars cleared of damp. Yet when Sir Henry asked about the tenants who lived farther out on the moor, Barrymore's replies grew even more measured. There were a few families who still paid rent, he said, though most kept to themselves. The Stapletons, brother and sister, lived in a modest cottage some miles distant. They collected butterflies and studied the plants of the bog. The rest were farmers and shepherds who rarely came near the hall. I watched the man closely while he spoke. His posture remained correct, his voice steady, yet there was a tension in the way he held his shoulders that suggested more than simple deference. Mrs. Barrymore kept to the shadows, moving quietly to light additional lamps. She was younger than her husband, with a face that might once have been handsome, but now carried the lines of long solitude. When she thought no one watched, her gaze lingered on Sir Henry with something close to unease. I noted the exchange without comment, filing it away for later reflection. We dined simply in the great room, the table set with plain silver and heavy china. Conversation stayed light, circling around plans for the next day. Sir Henry wished to ride out early and see the boundaries of the estate. Holmes suggested I accompany him while he remained behind to examine the house itself. The arrangement suited me. I wanted to observe the land and the people who worked it, to measure the distance between the hall and the nearest dwellings. After the meal, Sir Henry retired to his rooms. Holmes and I lingered a little longer, speaking in low voices of the precautions we must take. The moor was vast and empty, he reminded me. A man could vanish there without trace, and a hound might move unseen across the heather. I rose at first light and found Sir Henry already in the stables. 2 sturdy ponies waited, saddled and ready. We set out across the dew-wet grass, following a track that soon gave way to open moorland. The ground beneath us grew springy with peat, and the air smelled of wet earth and distant smoke. Sir Henry pointed out the low farms scattered along the horizon, naming the families who lived in each. Most were old tenants, he said, their families bound to the Baskervilles for generations. Yet he admitted he knew little of their current circumstances. As we rode, I kept watch on the ridges and hollows, searching for any sign of movement that did not belong to sheep or birds. By midday we had covered several miles. We stopped at a stone outcrop to rest the ponies and share the bread and cheese Mrs. Barrymore had packed. From that height, the hall looked small and remote, its chimneys barely visible above the folds of the land. Sir Henry spoke of his uncle's final days, of the fear that had driven the old man to London. He wondered aloud whether the same shadow had already begun to fall across his own path. I offered what reassurance I could, though the emptiness of the moor made every word feel thin. We turned back before the light faded, arriving at the hall as the first lamps were being lit. Barrymore met us at the door, his manner unchanged. He reported that Mr. Holmes had spent the afternoon walking the corridors and examining the unused wings. Dinner was served promptly, and the evening passed without incident. Yet, as I prepared for bed, I found myself listening to the wind that moved across the moor outside my window. It carried a low, restless sound, almost like the padding of heavy feet on soft ground. I extinguished the lamp and lay awake a while longer, thinking of the note, the footprint, and the long, uncertain road that still lay ahead. The house settled into silence around me, but the moor itself never truly slept. The morning light filtered through the curtains of my room at the inn, chasing away the shadows of the restless night. I dressed quickly and made my way downstairs, where a carriage awaited to carry me across the final stretch of moorland to Baskerville Hall. The driver, a taciturn fellow with a face weathered by years of exposure to the elements, said little as we rattled along the narrow track. The landscape unfolded around us in waves of heather and gorse, the distant hills rising like sentinels against the pale sky. As we drew nearer, the great house emerged from the mist, its granite walls dark and imposing, flanked by twisted oaks that seemed to guard secrets as old as the stones themselves. I stepped down from the carriage at the broad entrance and found myself facing a man of imposing stature. Barrymore stood in the doorway, his tall frame clad in a dark suit, his black beard neatly trimmed, and his eyes watchful beneath heavy brows. He greeted me with a measured courtesy, his voice low and resonant, as he introduced himself as the butler. Behind him, his wife hovered in the shadows of the hall, her figure slight and her face pale, marked by an expression that suggested both welcome and weariness. Mrs. Barrymore's eyes darted briefly to her husband before she offered a quiet word of greeting, her hands twisting the edge of her apron as if seeking comfort in the familiar gesture. The interior of the hall enveloped me in cool dimness. Ancient portraits lined the walls, their subjects staring down with stern, unblinking gazes that seemed to follow my progress across the flagged floor. Barrymore led me through the main rooms, his footsteps echoing softly in the vaulted spaces. He spoke of the house's history in careful phrases, avoiding any mention of recent events or the strange occurrences that had drawn me here. Yet there was a tension in his manner, a hesitation when I inquired about the staff or the daily routines. He assured me that everything was in order for Sir Henry's arrival later that day, but the words carried an undercurrent, as if rehearsed to deflect further questions. I settled into the library, where a fire had been laid in the wide hearth, and began to review my notes while waiting. The room smelled of leather bindings and aged wood, the shelves heavy with volumes that had not been disturbed in years. From time to time, I heard the soft movements of the Barrymores elsewhere in the house, their voices low and indistinct. Once, I caught a fragment of conversation between them, something about preparations that trailed off abruptly when footsteps approached. The sense of hidden currents grew stronger, as if the very walls absorbed and concealed the truths that lingered just out of reach. Sir Henry arrived in the early afternoon, his carriage drawing up with a crunch of gravel. He was a vigorous man, broad-shouldered and direct in his speech, his face flushed from the journey and the brisk air of the moor. We met in the drawing-room, where he extended a firm hand and expressed his relief at having someone familiar at his side. He spoke of the letter he had received in London, the warning about the hound, and the decision to return to his ancestral home despite the risks. Yet even as he voiced determination, I noticed the way his eyes strayed to the windows overlooking the moor, as if expecting to glimpse some shadow moving among the distant tors. Over tea, we discussed the household. Sir Henry praised the Barrymores' long service to the family, but when I mentioned the butler's reserved demeanour, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his features. He admitted that the man had seemed preoccupied of late, though he could offer no explanation. Mrs. Barrymore, too, appeared subdued, her usual efficiency tinged with a quiet melancholy that Sir Henry attributed to the general atmosphere of the place. As we talked, the hall seemed to press in around us, its corridors stretching into gloom and its doors standing slightly ajar, inviting yet forbidding. Later, as evening approached, I walked the grounds with Sir Henry. The air grew chill, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. We paused at the edge of the formal gardens, where the moor began its wild expanse. Sir Henry pointed out the path that led toward the Grimpen Mire, his voice steady, but his posture alert. He asked about my impressions of the hall so far, and I chose my words carefully, noting the loyalty of the servants while hinting at the unspoken strains I had observed. He listened in silence, nodding once, then turned his gaze outward once more. Dinner that night was served in the great dining room, the table set with silver that gleamed under the lamplight. Barrymore moved with silent efficiency, his wife assisting from the shadows. Conversation remained light at first, touching on the estate's farms and the need for repairs, but gradually the talk turned to the legend that hung over the family. Sir Henry recounted the tale of the hound in broad strokes, his tone dismissive, yet edged with something closer to unease. I watched the Barrymores. As he spoke, the butler's hand paused momentarily over a dish, and his wife's eyes lowered to the floor. After the meal, Sir Henry retired to his study, leaving me to reflect in the library once more. The fire crackled softly, casting shifting patterns across the faded rugs. I thought of the footprint we had seen in London, the anonymous note, and the way the moor seemed to breathe just beyond the windows. The house had welcomed us with outward civility, yet beneath that surface lay the weight of generations and the promise of revelations yet to come. As the night deepened, I extinguished the lamp and sat in the gathering dark, listening to the faint creaks of settling timber and the distant call of an owl from the moor. Morning brought a pale and uncertain light across the windows of Baskerville Hall, chasing away the shadows but not the lingering sense of watchfulness that had accompanied me through the hours of darkness. I rose, dressed quickly, and stepped outside to find the moor stretching before me like an endless grey sea, its surface broken by low hills and patches of coarse grass that swayed under a steady wind. The air carried a chill that cut through my coat, yet something drew me onward, away from the solid walls of the house and into the open expanse, where every sound seemed magnified. I walked for some time without meeting another soul, my boots sinking slightly into the soft turf. The landscape unfolded in layers of bleakness, with distant tors rising like ancient sentinels and thin streams cutting paths that vanished into hidden hollows. A faint mist clung to the lower ground, shifting with each gust and lending the whole scene an air of quiet menace. I paused at the crest of a small rise to catch my breath and take in the view, noting how the horizon seemed to press close, as if the moor itself were closing in around any intruder. It was there that I encountered a local man leading a pony cart along a narrow track. He tipped his hat and offered a few words of greeting, but his eyes darted toward the horizon with a wariness that invited conversation. When I asked about the region, he spoke of the escaped convict Selden, whose flight from Princetown Prison had set the countryside on edge. The man described how Selden had slipped away weeks earlier, armed and desperate, and how rumors placed him somewhere out here among the rocks and bogs.
No one ventures far after dark.
He added, his voice dropping as he glanced over his shoulder. The details painted a picture of a figure moving by night, sustained by stolen food and driven by a hatred for the world that had confined him. Continuing alone, I pressed deeper into the moor, following a path that grew narrower and less certain with each step. The ground underfoot changed from firm grass to patches of spongy earth that gave way without warning, forcing me to test each stride. Here and there, tufts of cotton grass marked the edges of wetter ground, their white heads nodding like silent warnings. The wind carried distant sounds, the cry of a curlew, the splash of water in some unseen pool, and once, what might have been the low call of a hound, far off among the hills. I thought of the legend that had brought us here, and felt the weight of it settle more heavily with every passing mile. Near midday I reached the fringes of the Grimpen Mire, a place the locals spoke of with open dread. From a safe distance on higher ground, I watched the surface shift and bubble in places, as if some great beast breathed beneath the peat. A farmer I met on the return path confirmed the stories, explaining how the mire had swallowed men and animals alike when they strayed from the known paths.
"One false step and the bog takes you.
He said, his face lined from years of watching the horizon.
It has no mercy for the careless."
His words lingered as I turned back toward the hall, the afternoon light already beginning to fade. By the time I reached the edge of the estate grounds, the day had given way to the long northern twilight. Lights glowed in the windows of Baskerville Hall, yet the moor behind me seemed to exhale a deeper chill. I stood for a moment at the boundary, listening to the rustle of wind through the gorse and wondering what other secrets the landscape might hold. The day had revealed dangers both human and natural, each one sharpening the mystery that had drawn us to this remote corner of the world. Twilight deepened into a thick purple haze as I turned from the hall and stepped once more onto the path that wound toward the tors. The lights behind me faded quickly, swallowed by the rising mist that clung to every hollow and crept along the edges of the granite outcrops. I had not gone far before the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint cry of a curlew and the heavier scent of damp peat. My boots sank slightly with each step, and I kept my hand near the pocket where I had placed the revolver earlier that afternoon. The moor was no place for idle wandering after dark, yet the questions left by the day refused to let me rest indoors. A narrow track led me upward between two low ridges. I had not walked more than half a mile when a figure appeared ahead, moving with quick, purposeful strides. As the distance closed, I recognized the lean form of a man in a tweed suit, his hat pulled low against the wind. He carried a butterfly net over one shoulder, an odd implement for such an hour and such a place. When he saw me, he stopped and raised a hand in greeting.
"Good evening.
He called.
You must be the new arrival from London. Dr. Watson, is it not?"
I admitted my name and asked how he knew it. He smiled, a quick flash of teeth that did not quite reach his eyes.
"News travels fast on the moor. I am Stapleton, of Merrypit House. My sister and I live just beyond the next ridge. You are welcome to walk with me if your business allows."
We fell into step together. Stapleton spoke easily of the district, naming the tors that rose like broken teeth against the sky and pointing out the treacherous patches of mire that could swallow a man to the waist. His knowledge seemed exact, almost affectionate, as though he had studied every stone and pool. Yet when I mentioned the legend of the hound, he fell silent for several paces before answering.
"Superstition clings to old families,"
He said at last.
"The moor remembers more than it reveals. Still, one must not let shadows govern the living."
A second figure waited where the track widened into a shallow bowl of grass. Miss Stapleton stood with her back to us, her dark cloak drawn close. She turned at the sound of our voices, and I saw at once that she was younger than her brother, with a face that might have been handsome under kinder light. Her greeting was polite but brief, and her gaze lingered on me with an expression I could not read. We continued together toward a cluster of rocks that formed a natural shelter. Stapleton pointed out rare plants that clung to the crevices and spoke of his collection with quiet enthusiasm. Miss Stapleton said little. Once, when her brother's attention was fixed on a patch of heather, she touched my sleeve and spoke in a low voice.
Take care on these pads, Doctor. Some who come here seeking answers find only more questions.
Before I could ask what she meant, Stapleton returned and the moment passed. We reached the edge of a broad tor where the wind blew colder. From that height, the distant lights of Baskerville Hall were visible again, small and uncertain. Stapleton remarked that the hall had stood for centuries, yet had never escaped the shadow of the moor. His tone was neutral, but I caught a note of something sharper beneath it, as though he measured the place and found it wanting. Night was nearly upon us when we parted. Stapleton offered to guide me back to the main track, but I declined, preferring to retrace my steps alone. Miss Stapleton's warning stayed with me as I descended. The moor seemed to press closer in the gathering dark, each boulder a potential hiding place, and every gust of wind a whispered threat. I walked quickly, listening for footsteps that did not belong to my own. By the time I reached the boundary wall, the hall's windows once more showed steady light. I paused there as I had earlier, but the chill I felt now came less from the air than from the memory of Miss Stapleton's words and the careful way her brother had steered our conversation away from certain subjects. The Stapletons were neighbours, certainly, yet their interest in the Baskerville affairs felt too precise to be mere curiosity. I wondered what they knew of the recent events and what they chose to keep hidden. Inside the hall, Sir Henry was already at dinner. I joined him without mentioning the encounter, choosing instead to listen as he spoke of his plans for the estate. His voice was hearty, but I noticed how often his eyes strayed to the windows and the darkness beyond. When the meal ended, I excused myself and climbed to my room, where a single lamp burned on the writing table. I sat for a time with a notebook open before me, recording the day's impressions while the wind rattled the casement. The Tors stood unseen in the night, yet their presence filled the quiet like an unanswered summons. I closed the notebook at last and extinguished the lamp, though sleep came slowly and brought no answers with it. The morning brought little relief from the restless night. I rose early, the chill of the moor still clinging to the stones of Baskerville Hall, and found Sir Henry already at breakfast, his face drawn from lack of sleep. We spoke little of the previous day's events, yet the weight of the legend hung between us like the mist outside the windows. After the meal, I excused myself, intent on a walk that might clear my thoughts, but my steps soon carried me toward the stables rather than the open heaths. It was there, near the rear entrance, that I first noticed the change in Barrymore. The butler moved with unusual haste, his eyes darting toward the shadowed corners of the yard. He carried a bundle of what looked like old clothing, and when he saw me, he offered a stiff bow before vanishing inside. The incident lingered in my mind through the afternoon. Sir Henry had business with the estate papers, leaving me free to wander the corridors under the pretext of inspecting the portraits that lined the gallery. Each canvas showed another grim Baskerville face, their eyes following me as though they too kept watch. Night fell early on the moor. The wind rose again, moaning around the gables, and I retired to my room with the door left ajar. Hours passed. The household settled into silence, broken only by the occasional creak of settling timber. I had almost surrendered to sleep when a faint sound reached me, a careful tread on the stairs below. Rising without a lamp, I slipped into the corridor and followed the sound downward. Barrymore stood at the window of the empty dining room, a single candle shielded in his hand. He had drawn the heavy curtains aside just enough to peer into the darkness. For several minutes he remained motionless, his broad shoulders hunched forward. Then he lifted the candle twice, a deliberate signal, before lowering it and retreating into the shadows. I pressed myself against the wall as he passed, close enough to hear the rasp of his breathing. He did not return to his quarters, but slipped out through the kitchen door into the night. I waited only long enough to be certain he had gone, then followed at a distance. The moon offered little light, yet the butler's lantern bobbed ahead like a will-o'-the-wisp across the gravel drive. He moved swiftly toward the edge of the estate, where the path gave way to rough grass and scattered rocks. I kept low, using the gorse bushes for cover, until the lantern halted near a low stone wall. Barrymore set it down and began to call out, his voice low and urgent, the words lost to the wind. A figure emerged from the darkness beyond the wall, a ragged shape that kept to the deeper shadows. The two men spoke for several minutes. I caught only fragments, enough to recognize the name Selden spoken twice, once in warning and once in answer. The escaped prisoner stood before me, gaunt and desperate, yet Barrymore passed him food and what appeared to be a folded garment. When the exchange ended, Selden slipped back into the night, and the butler retrieved his lantern to retrace his steps. I remained hidden until Barrymore had returned to the hall. Only then did I make my way back, entering through the same kitchen door he had left unlatched. My mind raced with the implications. Why would a trusted servant risk everything to aid a murderer on the moor? The connection to the convict was clear, yet the motive remained hidden. I returned to my room and recorded the details by the light of a single match, the flame trembling in my fingers. Morning brought Sir Henry to my door with questions about the day's plans. I answered carefully, revealing nothing of the night's discovery, though the knowledge burned within me. We rode out together across the moor, the great Grimpen Mire visible in the distance like a green wound upon the land. Sir Henry spoke of his plans to modernize the estate, yet his words carried little conviction. The shadow of his uncle's death still lay across every conversation. Later, alone in the library, I confronted Barrymore directly. He stood with his hands clasped behind his back, his face pale beneath the lamplight. I told him what I had seen without accusation, simply stating the facts. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he admitted the truth. The convict was his wife's brother, driven to desperation by poverty and a single violent act. Barrymore had promised his wife to help the man escape the country, supplying food and clothing under cover of darkness. He swore he had no hand in the death of Sir Charles, and begged that the matter not reach the police until Selden could be persuaded to surrender. I listened without interruption, weighing each word. The butler's loyalty to family explained the secrecy, yet it did not remove the danger. An armed murderer still roamed the moor, and the signals at the window might easily be interpreted as something more sinister. I assured Barrymore that I would speak to Sir Henry, but I made no promise of silence to the authorities. The man nodded once and left the room, his shoulders heavier than before. That evening I sat with Sir Henry by the fire, choosing my moment with care. I described the midnight meeting and the family tie that bound Barrymore to the fugitive. Sir Henry listened in silence, his pipe forgotten in his hand. When I finished, he rose and paced the length of the room, the flames casting long shadows across his face. He agreed that the butler must remain in service until the matter was resolved, yet he insisted on posting extra men at the gates. The escaped prisoner would not be allowed to threaten the household further. Outside, the wind had dropped, leaving the moor unnaturally still. I stood at the window and looked toward the dark line of the tors. Somewhere in that wilderness, Selden moved, sustained by the butler's aid, yet hunted by forces far older than any law. The mystery of the hound itself seemed to draw closer, its legend intertwined now with this new thread of family and betrayal. Sleep would come no easier tonight, but at least one secret had been drawn into the light. The morning light filtered weakly through the mist that clung to the Grimpen Mire like a shroud, and I rose from my restless vigil at the window with the weight of the night still pressing upon me. The dark line of the tors loomed unchanged, a jagged reminder that Selden roamed free, yet bound by shadows deeper than any prison wall. I breakfasted alone, my mind turning over the butler's confession and the tangled threads of inheritance that seemed to stretch across the moor. The hound's legend had taken root in my thoughts, feeding on every unexplained sound and every wary glance from the locals. Before the day grew too advanced, I resolved to call upon the Stapletons, whose cottage lay not far from the path that skirted the mire's edge. Jack Stapleton greeted me with the brisk courtesy of a man accustomed to solitude, his lean frame and quick eyes suggesting a naturalist's keen interest in every living thing around him. His sister, Beryl, stood a little behind him in the modest parlour, her expression composed yet shadowed by some unspoken concern. We spoke first of the weather and the moor's changing moods, but the conversation soon turned to the Baskerville estate and the troubles that had shadowed its halls. Stapleton leaned forward, his voice dropping to a measured tone as he described the treacherous bogs that could swallow a man without trace. He warned me plainly against venturing too near the mire after dusk, for the ground shifted and the vapours rose thick enough to confuse even the surest foot. The sister interjected softly then, her words carrying a note of urgency that surprised me. She spoke of the ancient curse that the villagers whispered about, the great black hound whose baying had been heard on nights when the wind howled across the tors. I listened without interruption, yet a chill traced my spine as she recounted how the beast was said to appear when the family line faced peril, its eyes glowing with unnatural fire. Stapleton dismissed the tale with a laugh, calling it superstition born of isolation, but his eyes did not quite meet mine when he said it. Outside, the wind stirred the reeds at the mire's border, and for a moment I fancied I heard a distant rumble, low and resonant, like the growl of something vast stirring in the peat. We walked together along the edge of the property, where Stapleton pointed out rare orchids and the faint tracks of moorland creatures. He spoke knowledgeably of the geology that made the mire so deadly, how underground springs kept the surface unstable, and how a single misstep could draw a man down into darkness. Yet his warnings carried an undercurrent I could not ignore. He mentioned Sir Henry by name, expressing hope that the new baronet would heed local cautions and avoid the lonelier paths. Beryl remained silent for much of the walk, but when we paused near a cluster of jagged rocks, she turned to me directly. Her voice trembled slightly as she described a night not long past when she had seen a massive shape moving against the skyline, its form indistinct yet unmistakable in its menace. The sound it made had driven her back to the cottage in haste, and she had not slept soundly since. I thanked them for their hospitality and their counsel, yet the encounter left me unsettled. The mire stretched out before us like a living thing, its surface dotted with deceptive patches of green that hid deep pools of black water. Stapleton insisted on escorting me part way back toward Baskerville Hall, continuing his discourse on the flora while glancing repeatedly toward the distant hills. Each time the wind rose, he paused, as if listening for something beyond ordinary hearing. When we parted at the crossroads, he clasped my hand firmly and repeated his warning once more, urging me to keep Sir Henry close to the house until the matter of the escaped convict was resolved. His sister offered a brief farewell, her face pale against the grey sky, and I thought I detected a flicker of fear in her eyes that no amount of rational talk could erase. Returning along the path, I found my thoughts circling back to the legend. The Stapletons' words had not dismissed the hound so much as they had given it shape in the present. What if the creature was no mere phantom, but a real animal, perhaps bred or trained by someone with knowledge of the moor? The mire itself seemed to breathe with hidden life, and every rustle in the heather set my nerves on edge. I reached the hall as afternoon shadows lengthened, and there I found Sir Henry pacing the study with evident agitation. He had received another of the anonymous letters, this one more direct in its caution against the moor at night. We compared notes in low voices, yet I withheld the full weight of my encounter for the moment, choosing instead to advise caution without revealing the source of my growing dread. Evening brought a heavier fog that rolled in from the west, muffling the usual sounds of the estate. I stood once more at my window, the tors now invisible behind the veil, and listened. Far off, carried on the damp air, came a sound that might have been wind, or might have been something else entirely. It rose and fell in a long, mournful cadence, echoing across the empty land. Sir Henry appeared at my door a moment later, his face drawn. Together we stepped onto the terrace and strained our ears, but the sound had already faded into the mist. Neither of us spoke of the hound, yet the silence between us spoke volumes. The following days passed in a tense routine of observation and quiet inquiry. I made further excursions onto the moor under the pretext of exercise, always keeping the Myre's warnings in mind. Stapleton crossed my path once more near a ruined stone circle, and our talk again circled the dangers of the region without ever naming the legend outright. He seemed eager to change the subject to his butterfly collection, yet the tension in his posture betrayed an awareness of larger matters. Beryl I saw only briefly from a distance, her figure hurrying between the cottage and the village with a basket on her arm. Each time the memory of her description returned, the chill deepened. By the week's end, the conviction had settled that the hound was no idle fancy. Whether flesh or spirit, it moved through the same wilderness that sheltered Selden and threatened the Baskerville line. The mire had become more than a geographical hazard. It was a place where old fears took form. I resolved to write my next report to Holmes with greater urgency, though the post would take days to reach him. In the meantime, the shadows lengthened, the wind carried its uncertain messages, and the hall stood guard against whatever prowled beyond its walls. The wind whispered through the gorse as I stepped beyond the threshold of Baskerville Hall, my boots sinking into the damp earth with each stride. The previous night's reports still weighed on my mind, the escaped convict Selden and the ancient curse that threatened the Baskerville line. The mire had become more than a geographical hazard. It was a place where old fears took form. I resolved to write my next report to Holmes with greater urgency, though the post would take days to reach him. In the meantime, the shadows lengthened, the wind carried its uncertain messages, and the hall stood guard against whatever prowled beyond its walls. Tonight, however, I could not wait. The path ahead drew me forward, lantern in hand, toward the rising tors where the fog clung like a second skin. I had not gone far when a low voice broke the silence from behind a cluster of rocks.
Watson, my dear fellow, you walk as loudly as a regiment on parade.
I spun around, heart pounding, and there stood Sherlock Holmes himself, cloaked in a rough tweed jacket stained with moorland mud, his sharp eyes gleaming in the half-light. He emerged slowly, hands raised in mock surrender, a faint smile playing at his lips.
Do not look so startled. I have been expecting you these past days.
Holmes guided me to a narrow cleft in the hillside, hidden by heather and a fallen slab of granite. Inside, a small camp revealed itself, a bedroll, a spirit stove, and scattered notes pinned with stones. He had been living here undetected, moving only at dusk or dawn to avoid the infrequent patrols and the prying eyes of the locals.
The post from London takes too long.
He explained, settling onto a flat rock.
I came down myself 3 weeks ago, after your first letters hinted at more than a simple family legend. The hound, Watson, is no phantom. It is flesh and bone, trained to a purpose.
We sat in the dim glow of my lantern while Holmes unfolded his findings. He had tracked footprints across the Grimpen Mire, impressions deeper than a man's but lighter than a horse's, leading to a ruined cottage where the creature was fed. Scraps of meat, fresh, told of recent activity. A local shepherd had glimpsed a tall figure in a grey coat near the same spot, but Holmes had shadowed him without detection. The true culprit, he believed, was no distant relative, but someone close to the estate, using the legend as cover for a calculated scheme of inheritance and fear. Stapleton's butterfly nets masked more than an innocent hobby. They allowed him to roam the moor freely, mapping every safe path through the bogs. Holmes's voice grew quieter as he described the night he nearly confronted the beast. It had appeared at the edge of the mire, eyes like coals, a low growl rolling across the water. He had hidden in the reeds, notebook in hand, sketching the creature's gait and noting the leather collar around its neck. The evidence mounted, a torn scrap of cloth matching a coat from the hall's wardrobe, a discarded pipe stem from the same tobacconist Sir Henry favoured. Each clue pointed not to superstition, but to human malice wrapped in ancient dread.
The Moor protects its secrets well, but patience reveals them all.
I listened, scribbling in my own notebook by the flickering light. Holmes had sent no word because any letter risked interception. His secret presence allowed him to watch Sir Henry directly, confirming the young baronet's safety while gathering the threads that would bind the guilty. The convict Selden's death had been a grim distraction, yet it also drew the real villain into the open. Holmes suspected the man would strike again soon, perhaps during the next full moon, when the hound could be loosed without witnesses. As the hours passed, the fog thickened outside our shelter. Holmes lit his pipe and offered me a share of his meagre rations, cold meat and hard biscuit. We spoke of London, of the Baker Street rooms we both missed, and of the case that had pulled us here. He praised my reports for their detail, though he corrected a few minor observations with a chuckle. The true work lay ahead. We would return to the hall together, Holmes remaining in shadow until the moment of confrontation. His plan was simple: lure the culprit into revealing the hound's keeper, then strike with the full weight of evidence and law. The night air grew colder. Holmes rose at last, extinguishing the lantern with a swift breath.
Come, Watson, the hall awaits, and so does our quarry. We move before dawn breaks.
We stepped from the cleft into the open moor, the wind rising once more. Behind us, the hidden camp stood empty, its secrets safe until needed. Ahead lay the path back to Baskerville Hall, where the shadows waited, and the truth, at last, would step into the light. We pressed onward across the damp earth, the wind rising to meet us with a low moan that seemed to carry voices from the depths of the mire. Holmes moved with purpose, his silhouette sharp against the grey veil that had begun to settle over the landscape, while I followed close, my thoughts turning to the hall and the dangers that might already be stirring within its walls. The lantern's light was gone, but the faint glow of dawn hinted at the horizon, barely piercing the fog that thickened with each step. The path wound upward toward Baskerville Hall, yet the moor refused to release us easily. Tendrils of mist coiled around our boots, muffling our footfalls and turning familiar landmarks into vague shadows. Holmes paused at a rise, his hand raised in silent caution, and we listened to the distant baying that echoed from somewhere ahead. It was not the cry of a common dog, but something deeper, more primal, a sound that clawed at the nerves and stirred old legends from their graves. Sir Henry had not remained indoors as we had hoped. We found him at the edge of the stone circle, his figure outlined against the swirling grey, a revolver in his grip, and his face set in grim determination. The baronet had ventured out alone, drawn by some restless impulse, or perhaps a warning he could not ignore.
Holmes.
He called, his voice carrying through the fog with a tremor that betrayed his resolve.
Watson. It comes for me at last.
The hound emerged without warning, a massive shape materializing from the mist like a nightmare-given form. Its eyes burned with an unnatural fire, yellow and fierce, while its jaws gaped to reveal teeth that gleamed even in the dim light. The creature's coat was matted and dark, streaked with the colors of the moor itself, and a low growl rumbled from its chest as it advanced on Sir Henry. The baronet fired once, the shot cracking through the silence, but the bullet only grazed the beast's flank, sending it into a frenzy of snarls and leaps. I drew my own weapon as Holmes shouted for us to hold our ground. The fog played tricks, distorting distances and making the hound seem larger with every bound. Sir Henry stood firm, his arm steady despite the terror that must have gripped him, and he aimed again, this time striking true enough to slow the creature's charge. Yet the hound pressed on, its paws thudding against the turf with relentless force, closing the gap until the reek of its breath filled the air. Its eyes never wavered. Holmes darted forward, his stick raised, and struck at the beast's head with a force that rang out like steel on bone. The hound recoiled, turning its fury toward him for a moment, and in that instant Sir Henry reloaded and fired a second shot. The impact staggered the creature, but it recovered with terrifying speed, lunging again toward the baronet. We fought as one then, Holmes and I flanking Sir Henry, while the Moor seemed to close in around us, the fog swallowing all but the immediate circle of combat. The hound's howls rose and fell, mingling with our labored breaths and the sharp reports of our revolvers. The confrontation stretched on in that shrouded arena, each moment etched with the threat of sudden death. Sir Henry dodged a swipe from those massive claws, his coat tearing as he rolled aside, and Holmes delivered another blow that drew a yelp from the beast. Blood darkened the creature's side now, yet it showed no sign of retreat, driven by some infernal purpose that kept it circling and striking. The mist swirled thicker, at times obscuring the hound entirely so that we struck at phantoms, only to feel its hot breath return from an unexpected angle. At last, a final volley from our weapons found its mark. The hound staggered, its legs buckling beneath it, as a long, mournful wail escaped its throat. It collapsed onto the wet ground, the fire in its eyes dimming as the life ebbed away, leaving only the massive, ruined form amid the fog. Sir Henry lowered his revolver, his chest heaving, and we stood in silence for a long moment, the weight of what had transpired settling over us like the mist itself. The moor offered no further sounds, only the faint sigh of wind through the heather. Holmes examined the fallen beast with clinical care, confirming what we had suspected all along. The terror that had haunted the Baskervilles was no phantom, but a living weapon, now silenced at last. We turned back toward the hall as the first true light of day began to burn through the fog, the path ahead clearer than it had been in many nights. We made our way back to the hall as the first true light of day began to burn through the fog, the path ahead clearer than it had been in many nights. Holmes walked ahead with a steady stride, his eyes fixed on the horizon, while I followed close behind, the weight of the night's events pressing on my thoughts. The great house loomed before us, its windows catching the first pale rays, and inside we found Sir Henry already stirring, his face drawn from restless sleep. Holmes motioned us both into the study without a word, closing the door behind him with deliberate care. The fire had burned low in the grate, and Holmes stood before it, turning to face us with that familiar intensity in his gaze.
Gentlemen,
He began, his voice low and even.
The time has come to lay bare the truth that has shadowed this house for so long. The hound was no legend born of superstition. It was a living creature, bred and trained for a single purpose by a man who stood among us all along.
Sir Henry leaned forward in his chair, his hands gripping the arms, but Holmes raised a hand to still any questions. He reached into his coat and drew out a small vial, holding it to the light where the residue inside gleamed faintly green.
Phosphorus?
Holmes continued, setting the vial on the desk between us.
Applied to the beast's coat to make it appear as a spectral terror in the darkness. Stapleton acquired the hound from a dealer in the north, a savage mastiff crossed with bloodhound stock, selected for its size and ferocity. He kept it hidden in that lonely cottage on the edge of the mire, feeding it just enough to keep its hunger sharp while he perfected his plan.
I listened in silence, the pieces of our long pursuit falling into place like tumblers in a lock. Stapleton had posed as a naturalist, his butterfly nets and specimen cases nothing more than a clever mask for his true intentions. Holmes paced the length of the room now, his boots soundless on the carpet.
Stapleton is no distant stranger to this family. He is the direct heir, the son of the late Roger Baskerville, who fled to South America years ago under a cloud of scandal. There he married and fathered this man, who later returned to England under an assumed name, biding his time until the opportunity arose. Sir Charles's death was the first move, engineered through fear alone. The old man saw the glowing apparition on the moor that fateful night, and his heart gave way. Stapleton needed only to wait for Sir Henry to claim the inheritance before striking again.
Sir Henry drew a sharp breath but said nothing, his eyes fixed on Holmes as the story unfolded. The explanation came in measured sentences, each fact supported by the evidence we had gathered over weeks of observation. Stapleton had studied the family history in secret, learned of the old legend, and twisted it to his advantage. The mire itself became his ally, its treacherous paths known only to him through careful mapping. He lured his victims to the spot where the hound could be released without witness, counting on the fog and darkness to conceal his hand. We had suspected the naturalist's involvement from the start, but confirmation came with the discovery of the missing boot and the traces of the luminous paint on the rocks near the scene of the final confrontation. Holmes described how Stapleton had trained the animal to respond to a whistle, a low signal carried on the wind that sent it bounding across the heather in pursuit. The beast was kept muzzled and chained until needed, its coat daubed afresh each time to maintain the eerie glow.
A cruel device.
Holmes added, pausing to glance at the window where the moor stretched beyond, now bathed in honest daylight.
Yet effective until we turned his own weapon against him.
The full scope of the scheme revealed itself as Holmes spoke. Stapleton had intended to eliminate both Sir Charles and Sir Henry, leaving the path clear for his own claim through forged documents and distant relations. His wife, the woman we had known as his sister, played her part in the deception, though her loyalty wavered under the strain. The warning note to Sir Henry, the stolen items from the hall, even the anonymous letters, all traced back to that isolated cottage. Holmes had pieced it together through patient surveillance, noting the comings and goings, the purchases of strange chemicals, and the sudden disappearance of local dogs that matched the hound's description. As the morning light strengthened, Holmes concluded with the final details. The hound lay dead on the mire, its terror ended by our bullets, and Stapleton himself had fled into the bog in the chaos, his escape cut short by the very quicksands he had once used as cover. The authorities would soon arrive to secure the cottage and its grim contents. Sir Henry rose at last, his voice steady despite the revelations.
Then it is over,
He said simply. Holmes nodded once.
The villain stands unmasked, and the Baskerville line may rest free of this shadow.
We stood together in the quiet room, the weight lifting with each breath of clear air that drifted through the open window. With the truth laid bare before us, we gathered ourselves and stepped out into the pale morning light that had begun to creep across the moor. The air carried a chill that bit at our faces, yet it felt cleaner than the stifling atmosphere we had left behind in the cottage. Holmes led the way with purposeful strides, his keen eyes scanning the distant hills where Merripit House lay half hidden in mist. Sir Henry walked beside him, his jaw set firm, while I followed a pace behind, the weight of our recent revelations still settling into my bones. The authorities would handle the grim discoveries at the cottage, but the true architect of the Baskerville terror remained at large, and we knew he would not surrender without a final struggle. Holmes paused at the edge of the path and turned to us.
Stapleton believes himself secure in his schemes,
He said, his voice low and measured.
but the moor itself will betray him if he chooses flight. We must reach him before he vanishes into the bogs.
Sir Henry nodded, his hand resting on the pistol at his belt.
Lead on, then.
He replied.
I have waited long enough for justice.
Together we pressed forward, the heather crunching under our boots, the distant call of a curlew echoing across the empty landscape. As we approached the farmhouse, a figure emerged from the doorway, cloak billowing in the rising wind. Stapleton's eyes widened at the sight of us, but he recovered quickly with a thin smile.
Gentlemen,
He called out, "What brings you so early to my door? I trust there has been no further trouble with that wretched hound."
Holmes did not return the pleasantry. Instead, he advanced steadily, detailing in clear terms the web of deception that had ensnared the Baskervilles. Stapleton's face paled as each thread was pulled tight, the evidence of his false identity and calculated murders laid out without mercy. For a moment he stood frozen. Then, with a sudden curse, he bolted toward the open moor, his cloak streaming behind him like a dark banner. We gave chase at once, our feet pounding over uneven ground. The villain wove between tors and through patches of gorse, but the mire soon loomed ahead, its surface deceptively smooth and green. Stapleton glanced back once, terror plain in his features, then plunged onward into the treacherous fen. Holmes called a warning, but it came too late. The ground yielded beneath the man's weight, sucking him down with relentless force. His arms flailed as he sank deeper, the mire closing over his legs, then his waist. A desperate cry escaped him, raw and echoing, before the bog swallowed his voice entirely. We reached the edge in time to see only his outstretched hand vanish beneath the bubbling surface, leaving nothing but ripples that faded into stillness. Sir Henry stood rigid, breathing hard from the run.
It is done,
He murmured, the words carrying both relief and a trace of horror. Holmes placed a steadying hand on his shoulder.
The Moor has rendered its own verdict.
He observed quietly. We remained there for several minutes, watching the site where justice had claimed its due, the wind whispering through the reeds as if mourning the end of a long deception. Then we turned back, the path to Baskerville Hall stretching before us under clearing skies. Upon our return, the household staff greeted us with anxious faces, but Sir Henry quickly reassured them that the threat had passed. We gathered in the great hall, where a fire crackled in the hearth, driving away the lingering damp of the moor. Holmes recounted the morning's events in concise detail, sparing none of the grim facts, yet framing them with the precision that always marked his explanations. Sir Henry listened without interruption, his expression shifting from grim acceptance to quiet triumph as the full scope of the plot was revealed. The hound, that spectral beast of legend, had been nothing more than a trained animal coated in phosphorus to glow in the dark, a tool wielded by Stapleton to terrify and kill. With its master gone, the creature itself had been found earlier and secured by the arriving constables. As evening drew near, we walked the grounds of the estate together. Sir Henry paused at the ancient yew trees that bordered the lawn and looked out across the rolling moorland.
For generations, my family has lived under this shadow.
He said, his voice steady once more.
Now the curse is broken, and I may begin anew without fear of unseen paws or glowing eyes at my window.
Holmes agreed with a single nod.
The line is secure.
He affirmed.
What remains is to live free of its weight.
I watched them in silence, struck by the simple dignity of the moment, the way the setting sun gilded the hills and banished the last traces of gloom from the landscape. Later, over a simple meal prepared by the cook, conversation turned to lighter matters. Sir Henry spoke of his plans to restore the hall to its former vitality, inviting neighbours and perhaps even hosting modest gatherings once the memory of recent events had faded. Holmes offered practical suggestions drawn from his own observations of estate management, while I contributed what little I could from my medical perspective on the toll such prolonged anxiety might take. The talk flowed easily, unburdened by the need for constant vigilance that had defined our days on the moor. Night fell softly over the hall. We retired to the library, where Holmes lit a pipe and settled into an armchair, the glow of the lamp casting warm circles on the bookshelves. Sir Henry joined us shortly after, carrying a decanter of brandy that we sipped in companionable quiet. Outside, the wind had dropped to a gentle sigh, and no strange howls rose from the distant bogs. In that calm, I felt the final threads of the Baskerville mystery draw to their close, the moor itself seeming to exhale after years of harbouring its dark secrets. By morning, the constables had completed their work at the cottage, removing all traces of Stapleton's hidden laboratory and the pitiable remains of his wife, whose death he had orchestrated to silence her knowledge of his crimes. We assisted where needed, ensuring every detail was recorded for the official record. Holmes's testimony would prove invaluable in closing the case without further inquiry into the supernatural elements that had once clouded the affair. Sir Henry oversaw the proceedings with quiet authority, his bearing transformed now that the burden had lifted. In the days that followed, the estate began to stir with new life. Workmen arrived to repair fences and clear overgrowth, while letters of condolence and congratulations arrived from distant relations who had learned of the resolution. Sir Henry read them aloud to us one evening, his voice carrying a note of genuine warmth. The Baskerville name, once whispered with dread, would soon be spoken with respect again. As our own departure neared, Holmes and I stood once more at the hall's threshold, surveying the moor that had tested us so thoroughly. The path ahead promised return to London and the familiar rhythm of Baker Street, yet the memory of these events would linger. Sir Henry clasped our hands in farewell, his gratitude plain.
You have given me back my future,
He said simply. Holmes smiled faintly.
The Moor keeps its own accounts.
He replied.
We merely observe them settle.
We boarded the train that afternoon under clear skies, the wheels clacking steadily over the rails as the landscape rolled away behind us. The Baskerville curse was no more than a tale for fireside telling, its power broken by reason and resolve. In the quiet carriage, I reflected on the justice that had unfolded on those wild moors, a fitting end for a villain whose ambitions had drawn him too deep into the mire of his own making.